All right, so are you ready to dive into some pretty murky waters?
Always.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Because you sent over a ton of interviews and reports on this Cybertruck bombing at the Trump International Hotel in Vegas. And man, calling this a rabbit hole
I mean,
doesn't even begin to describe it.
yeah.
Without a Green Beret, talk of government cover-ups, and even whispers of technology that sounds straight out of sci-fi,
Right.
And the biggest question is the bomber, Matthew Livelsberger, even dead.
I think what really grabs you about this whole story is how it starts out.
Yeah.
Like, we begin with what seems like a pretty straightforward act of terrorism. But then every detail you dig up, the situation just gets weirder and weirder.
Totally. And it all starts with this email Levelsberger sends to Sam, the host of the Terminal CWO Instagram account. Just days before the bombing, he's claiming he's being followed by the FBI and that he's got this massive VBID, which for anyone who's not up on their military jargon, stands for a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. Basically, we're talking about a car bomb. But what really sets this apart is the language he uses, right?
Oh, yeah?
He says what he's about to do is going to change the course of humanity.
That's the thing that gets me. That phrase, change the course of humanity. It feels way bigger than just like a personal grudge or some political thing. It almost implies that he thought he had this knowledge or this tech that could, I don't know, change the world,
For sure. And then there's this whole thing about gravitic propulsion systems, which Levelsberger claims both China and the U.S. are using.
Yeah, that's a new one.
Right. You don't hear that every day. Like, most people are familiar with the idea of anti-gravity.
Yeah.
But gravitic seems different somehow, more advanced, maybe. And you definitely don't see it in any official reports. Have you ever come across that term in your research?
Oh, it's not exactly mainstream, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Gravitic propulsion, from what little I understand. It basically involves manipulating gravity itself to create motion. No clunky engines, no exhaust, just like near silent movement, maybe even instantaneous movement. If this tech actually exists, it completely revolutionized everything, transportation, warfare.
Everything.
Everything.
So then we got to ask, was Levelsberger delusional? Or did he actually have access to information the public isn't supposed to know? Because he also claimed there was a cover-up involving the DOD, the DEA, and the CIA, all tied to this 2019 airstrike in Afghanistan that resulted in a lot of civilian casualties. And actually, you included a UN report on airstrikes in Afghanistan from that year in those documents you sent over. Anything interesting in there?
Well, the UN report, it does back up Levelsberger's claim that U.S. airstrikes on what they said were drug facilities in Afghanistan. Yeah, they resulted in a lot of civilian deaths.
Yeah.
So at least part of his story checks out. He even names names in the email you sent. A DEA agent and a military commander, who he says can back up his story. Do those names ring a bell?
Yeah, I looked into them, and get this. Multiple Green Berets, including Tim Kennedy, have actually confirmed Levelsberger was a real soldier. This wasn't just some random dude making stuff up online. This guy had a story to tell, and he was determined to get it out there, one way or another. But that brings us to the bombing itself. Why use a Tesla Cybertruck loaded with fireworks for an attack?
Right.
Why not something more conventional?
Like something with more punch.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The Cybertruck, with that kind of supposedly bulletproof exterior and self-driving features, it almost seems like it was chosen on purpose. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's what some people are calling the Tesla incident theory. The idea that Levelsberger might have used the Cybertruck to fake his own death, using those very features, especially when you consider the inconsistencies you pointed out. No gunshot residue, the body they found didn't match Levelsberger's son's DNA. And the explosion itself was, well, kind of pathetic, really.
Yeah, like a dud.
It's almost like it was meant to cause confusion, not casualties. What do you make of that?
It definitely makes you wonder if this was really a suicide bombing or like some kind of carefully staged performance to send a message. The lack of a clear motive, the weird choice of weapon, the inconsistencies around the whole event, it all points to something more complicated than what we see at first glance.
And then there's that detail about Levelsberger's signal safety number changing after the bombing. Did the FBI get into his account? Or did he change it himself as part of this whole scheme? When Sam contacted the FBI, they were polite but didn't say much. He even had to explain to them what a VBID was. Which seems kind of odd, considering we're talking about the FBI here.
Yeah, that's not a detail you just brush off.
Yeah.
It either suggests the FBI wasn't really ready for a case this technologically complex, especially if we're talking about something like gravitic propulsion. Or maybe Levelsberger was operating on a level even the authorities couldn't quite grasp.
Right. And then, to make things even more confusing, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, the CID, they got involved. And the Army's Public Affairs Department, they tried to downplay everything, suggesting Levelsberger's actions were due to personal issues. But, come on, does that really explain his claims about advanced tech and a government cover-up?
Yeah, it's a convenient explanation, but it doesn't really answer the important questions. And speaking of advanced tech, we can't ignore Levelsberger's warnings about drones using this gravitic propulsion and the threat they pose to national security. It's not just theoretical anymore. You remember that story he sent about the police chief in New Jersey? The one who encountered those crazy fast drones that they couldn't even track?
Oh, yeah, that one was wild. These weren't your everyday hobby drones, you know. These things were moving with speed and agility that was way beyond anything commercially available. Makes you wonder if those drones were a glimpse of what Levelsberger was talking about.
Right. And it all ties into this larger pattern we've been seeing with those UAP reports. Unidentified aerial phenomena. Remember the 2004 Nimitz incident? Commander David Fravor reported a UAP with no visible propulsion system. Could these be connected somehow?
It's definitely a lot to consider. And Sam, the guy Levelsberger emailed, he was so freaked out by all of this that he actually issued a call to action, urging his listeners to get involved in community safety initiatives, especially at schools. He feels like the government's failing to protect people from these new threats.
It's a scary thought, but you got to take it seriously. If the government knows about these threats but can't or won't do anything about them, that raises some serious questions about our national security and the role technology plays in shaping our future.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this potential bombshell in Vegas with Levelsberger and the Cybertruck. But on that same day, January 1st, you also flagged something else that happened. An attack in New Orleans carried out by a former Army reservist who had apparently become radicalized in the past year.
Huh. Two seemingly unconnected attacks, both with possible ties to the military, both on New Year's Day. You got to wonder if there's a connection.
It's definitely strange, and I'm not going to lie, it's making my head spin a little. And then on top of all that, you included reports about Iranian-made man-pads, those are surface-to-air missiles, right, being smuggled across the U.S. border. And sources both inside and outside the government have confirmed this.
Yeah, that's pretty unsettling.
Understatement of the century.
It definitely raises the stakes. If terrorist groups can get their hands on weapons like that, and the government's struggling to contain these advanced drones that might be using gravitic propulsion, well, we could be looking at a perfect storm of security threats.
It's a lot to process, and frankly, it's kind of terrifying. But let's take a step back for a minute and look at the bigger picture. If Levelsberger was right about this gravitic propulsion tech, what does that mean for national security and the balance of power on a global scale?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If this tech is real and as advanced as Levelsberger claimed, it could completely reshape the geopolitical landscape.
Totally. That's a great point, and I think we need to unpack that a bit more. What would widespread gravitic propulsion tech mean for warfare? Would it make war more likely or less likely? What are the ethical implications of something like that?
Those are the questions that keep me up at night, and that's what we'll be diving into next.
Sounds like we're just getting started.
You know, when you step back and look at these two attacks on New Year's Day, the contrast is pretty striking. You got the Cybertruck bombing in Vegas, which, as we've been talking about, it almost feels staged, you know?
Yeah.
The performance.
I see what you mean.
And then you have the New Orleans attack, which seems much more like a traditional brutal assault. Guns, explosives, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, that difference in execution is really interesting. It's like they had completely different goals in mind. Levelsberger seemed to want to expose something to get a message out. But the New Orleans attacker, it's like they were driven by pure rage. Just a desire to cause as much harm as possible.
And then you add that ISIS flag they found in New Orleans to the mix. It makes you wonder, was this a real ISIS attack? Or a deliberate attempt to throw investigators off the scent?
Yeah, good point.
We got to remember, we're dealing with individuals who might be trained in deception, psychological warfare, especially if they have military backgrounds.
It makes you wonder if there are forces at play here that we're not even aware of. Are we being manipulated? Are these events part of a bigger orchestrated plan, and we're just seeing tiny pieces of it?
It's definitely a possibility we can't just ignore. But even if these events are pieces of a bigger puzzle, understanding why each person did what they did, that's key to understanding the whole picture.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to Levelsberger for a second. In his email, he specifically mentioned wanting to connect with guys like Sean Ryan and Pete Hegseth. What do you think he saw in those two? Why them?
Well, both Ryan and Hegseth are known for their military backgrounds and their platforms. which, tend to lean towards more conservative viewpoints.
Right.
So maybe Levelsberger thought they'd be more likely to believe his story, more willing to consider his claims about a government cover-up and advanced technology. Maybe he thought the mainstream media would just dismiss him as, a conspiracy theorist.
It's funny you say that, conspiracy theorist,
Yeah.
because he also claimed to have a TSSCI clearance, which is a pretty serious level of security clearance, and access to something called USAP. I've never even heard of that. Have you?
USAP. No, that's not a common acronym, even within the intelligence community. Could be a super classified program we just don't know about.
Yeah.
Or maybe Levelsberger made it up to make his story sound more believable.
But wouldn't someone with his clearance know better than to just make something like that up? He'd know someone would check, right?
Maybe. Maybe not. We are questioning his mental state, remember. If he truly believed there was this massive conspiracy, he might have felt justified in, bending the truth a little to get his message out. Or, who knows, maybe USAP is real. But it's so top secret that even the people investigating Levelsberger don't know about it.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. We're dealing with a possible whistleblower with knowledge of advanced tech and a government cover-up, who might be dead or might not be, who may or may not have staged a bombing to expose a conspiracy that may or may not exist. Did I miss anything?
You pretty much nailed it. It's a situation where truth and fiction are so intertwined, it's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing, and the other half might be from a completely different puzzle.
And then on top of all that, we've got these reports of Iranian missiles being smuggled into the U.S., which, if it's true, is a whole other level of crazy.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. The thought of Iranian-made man-pads on U.S. soil is terrifying. Those weapons are easy to hide, easy to move around, and incredibly deadly. They could target aircraft, government buildings, even crowds of people.
It feels like we're facing multiple threats at the same time, each one more complex and dangerous than the last. No wonder people are feeling anxious and uncertain. So, what do you think? Are all these events connected somehow, or are we just overthinking it?
It's human nature to look for patterns, to try and connect the dots, especially when we're dealing with things that scare us. Sometimes those connections are real, and sometimes they're just our own fears talking. The trick is to stay objective, to look at the evidence carefully, and not jump to conclusions.
All right, so where do we go from here? We've laid out the basic pieces of the puzzle, but we're still missing a lot of information. We've got these intriguing details about Lovelsberger, the Cybertruck, and his claims about advanced technology. But we're also dealing with the very real threat of smuggled Iranian missiles.
I think it's time to shift gears a little. Move from the specific events to the bigger context. Instead of getting lost in the weeds, let's explore what widespread gravitic propulsion technology could mean, how the threat landscape is changing, and how the government's responding to all of this.
It's like every time we peel back a layer of this story, we find another layer underneath, like one of those Russian nesting dolls.
That's a great way to put it. And as we go deeper into this puzzle, we need to stay sharp, stay critical, and above all, keep searching for the truth wherever it leads.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack these bigger implications. If gravitic propulsion tech is real, how does that change our understanding of national security and the balance of power globally? What does it mean for the future?
Imagine a world where aircraft can move at hypersonic speeds, completely undetected by radar. Think about what that does to our current understanding of warfare. Traditional air defenses, useless. The whole concept of air superiority would be completely redefined, and the balance of power would shift dramatically.
You're not just talking about drones here. You're talking about entire fleets of fighter jets, bombers, even transport aircraft, all operating with tech that makes them invisible and unstoppable.
Exactly. And think about intelligence gathering and surveillance. Satellites could be replaced by high-altitude platforms with capabilities we can't even imagine right now. Borders would become meaningless.
It's like something out of a sci-fi nightmare. And if Levelsberger was right, and China is already ahead of us in this tech, well, that puts the U.S. at a serious disadvantage.
That's the scary reality we have to face. And if the government knows about this gap, it might explain why they're so hesitant to openly talk about UAPs or the threat of these advanced drones.
He is admitting that we're falling behind. That would cause mass panic, right?
Well,
And totally undermine confidence in our national security.
exactly. Publicly acknowledging the threat could also trigger a global arms race, as every country scrambles to catch up.
But wouldn't it be better to be honest with people, to inform the public and work together with other nations to deal with this?
In a perfect world, yes. Open collaboration and dialogue would be the ideal solution. But in the real world, governments tend to prioritize secrecy and control, especially when it comes to national security. They might think that downplaying the threat is necessary to avoid instability and chaos.
So basically, the public's left in the dark, while those in power are trying to deal with what could be an existential threat.
It's a tough situation, no doubt about it. It shows the challenges we face in the 21st century. Technology is advancing faster than we can understand it, and we're struggling to adapt.
And the constant information overload just makes it harder to separate fact from fiction.
Exactly. Which is why critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism are more important now than ever. We can't just blindly accept everything we hear. We have to question our assumptions, look at the evidence, and be wary of simple explanations for complex problems.
So it's a call to action then. We can't just sit back and wait for the government to tell us what's going on. We have to be involved in shaping our own future.
Absolutely. And that means demanding accountability from those in power. If they're keeping information from us that affects our safety and security, we have a right to know.
This is about empowering ourselves to think for ourselves, to have real conversations about the things that matter.
And recognizing that we, as citizens, have a responsibility to shape the course of events.
You know, Livelsberger may have gone about things the wrong way, but his desire to expose the truth, to hold those in power accountable, I think we can all relate to that.
I agree. In a world full of misinformation and manipulation, the commitment to finding the truth is more important than ever.
So what advice would you give to our listeners out there? What can they do to make sense of this crazy, complicated world?
The most important thing is to stay informed. Read from a variety of sources, be critical of what you read, don't believe everything you hear, and always ask questions.
And don't be afraid to get involved. Be active in your community. Advocate for policies that promote transparency and accountability. Support organizations that are working to expose corruption and wrongdoing.
Knowledge is power. The more we understand about the world, the better equipped we'll be to face its challenges and shape its future.
I like that. Knowledge is power. This deep dive has definitely been a real eye-opener. It's a little overwhelming, to be honest, but it's also empowering, you know? It reminds us that we're not powerless. We can make a difference.
That's the right attitude. Even when things seem uncertain and complex, there's always hope. As long as we keep searching for the truth and work together to create a better world, we can overcome any challenge.
That's good to hear. Before we move on, though, I gotta ask about those Iranian missiles. What happened to them? Did they ever find them?
That's still a mystery. The government hasn't said much about the investigation, and there's been no official word on whether they recovered the missiles.
Which, of course, just raises more questions. Are they still out there? Are they in the wrong hands? Or was this all just a big misunderstanding, a threat that never really existed?
We may never know the whole story. But the fact that it happened, that there's even a possibility of Iranian missiles being in the U.S., it shows just how vulnerable we are in this globalized world.
It reminds us that even the most powerful country in the world is still vulnerable, and that we need to be prepared.
Absolutely. And it also highlights the need for international cooperation. We can't solve problems like terrorism and weapons proliferation on our own. It takes a global effort.
So even though we're wrapping up this deep dive on the information you sent, the conversation definitely doesn't end here. There's still so much to learn, so much to explore.
The pursuit of knowledge never really ends. It challenges us, inspires us, and ultimately connects us to something bigger than ourselves.
You know, for all the unsettling things we've talked about today, there's also a sense of excitement, of possibility. We're living in a time of rapid change, of unprecedented challenges, but also incredible innovation and opportunity.
It's a time of both danger and promise. And as we navigate this uncharted territory, let's embrace the unknown with curiosity and courage, and strive to create a future that lives up to our highest ideals.
I love that. Well said. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. We've talked about advanced tech, government cover-ups, the changing balance of global power, but there's a more fundamental question we haven't really addressed. What does it mean to be human in an age of accelerating technological advancement?
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own deep dive. Maybe we can explore that another time.
I'm looking forward to it. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. That's a really interesting point you just brought up. What does it even mean to be human when technology is changing so fast around us all the time?
Right.
Like, we've been talking about threats and advancements that practically sound like they're ripped from a sci-fi movie. But technology in and of itself, it's not inherently good or bad, is it?
It's all in how we use it, right? Technology is a tool at the end of the day. And just like any tool, you can use it to build something, or you can use it to tear something down. It's up to us to decide how we develop and use these advancements, how we govern ourselves, and in the end, how we treat each other.
That's a good point. And in a way, that's what Levelsberger was trying to do, wasn't he? Force this conversation to happen. He may have gone about it in a totally radical, maybe even destructive way, but at the heart of it, he was concerned about accountability, transparency, and the potential for power to be misused.
Yeah, his actions were definitely extreme. But they do make you stop and think about these issues. Maybe we can even use this whole event as a starting point for a bigger conversation about the challenges and opportunities we're facing as we move into this new technological era.
I like that. So let's talk about the future of warfare. If this gravitic propulsion tech does become widespread, is it just a matter of time before it leads to another global conflict? Or could it actually make war less likely?
That's the question everyone's trying to figure out right now, isn't it? Military strategists, policymakers, everyone. It's complicated, that's for sure. On one hand, you've got these weapons that are so fast, so stealthy, so destructive. They could make any future war completely unpredictable and way more devastating than anything we've ever seen.
You're talking about a first strike so powerful it could wipe out an entire country before they even knew what hit them.
Yeah, exactly. The potential for destruction is terrifying, honestly. But on the other hand, maybe the very existence of these weapons could actually prevent war. Remember AMA, mutually assured destruction. That idea helped prevent nuclear war during the Cold War. Maybe that becomes even more relevant in a world with gravitic warfare.
Because if you launch a first strike, you know you're going to get hit back even harder.
Right. The stakes are so high, and the potential for unintended consequences is so huge, you'd hope it would make even the most aggressive countries hesitate.
So it's not really about the tech itself, it's about how we choose to use it.
Exactly. And that's why the ethical questions are so important. We need to have a serious conversation about how we develop and use this gravitic propulsion technology. What safeguards can we put in place to make sure it's not misused? What international agreements can we come up with to govern its development? These aren't questions any one country can answer on its own.
It has to be a global conversation, right?
Yeah.
Scientists, ethicists, policymakers, everyday people, everyone needs to be involved.
Exactly. This isn't something that should be decided in secret. The future we create is everyone's responsibility.
You know, we've talked about a lot of dark stuff in this deep dive, but hearing you talk about the need for open discussion and working together, it actually makes me feel a little bit hopeful. Maybe if we can face these challenges head on, if we can have these tough conversations, we have a chance to create a future that's better for everyone.
I agree. We shouldn't let complexity and uncertainty paralyze us. Let's look at this as a chance to shape a future that we can all be proud of.
That's a great way to look at it. We've covered so much ground today. Government cover-ups, a possible revolution in warfare, what it means to be human in a world of crazy tech. It's a lot to process, I know, but I hope it's been eye-opening.
That's what we aim for with these deep dives, to give you the knowledge and insights you need to make sense of this increasingly complex world.
We want to encourage you to think critically, to question everything, and to talk about the things that are important to you.
We're all in this together, and the more we learn and the more we engage, the better prepared we'll be for whatever comes next.
So even though this particular deep dive is coming to an end, the conversation definitely doesn't stop here.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And until next time, keep diving deep.